Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. My name is Justin Wagner with Team ODZ. I'd like to welcome you to this show. We've got a group ride going on in Zwift. Nice, chill group ride. We're going to ride together and learn about the basics of power-based training. I'll be the presenter today, and we're going to be talking about that dreaded FTP test. Talk about why it's important, some different methods about going about it, why it's important. Go into it in detail. We'll have 15 minutes of teaching followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. So if you have questions, let them fly either in the Discord chat or on the Facebook Live video, and I'll see them and we'll be able to address them as they come up. You give me a second to send a message to the group and then get the live video rolling on my end so that I can monitor that chat as it comes in. Great. Here we go. And we are about to roll out. Morning, Martin. Thanks for joining us. We are got the group ride rolling. I'm going to dial in 1.5 to 1.8 watts per kilo. And see, we are gonna move slides view here. Okay. Alrighty, so FTP test. This is loosely based off of the content in chapter 3 of training and racing with the power meter. If you don't have this book and you're wanting to understand and learn power-based training, highly recommend getting it. I don't make money off you buying it. It's not an expensive book, maybe $15. You get on Amazon, you can probably get it used for a lot less than that. Definitely a worthwhile investment to really dig in and understand these concepts yourself. So that chapter is about getting started. And so in the previous episodes, we've talked about why we should get a power meter, how you should set up your data screens, how to kind of get prepared. And now we're going to move into, okay, so we've got power, we've got screens. But what do we do next? Where does this FTP come into play? And so that's where we're going to talk about the structured FTP test and how that leads into power-based training intervals. So one of the things I wanted to give perspective on is before you go barreling into an FTP test, I think you need a little bit of time to get a feel for what these wattage numbers mean. So how would I suggest doing that? Well, go to some areas, some rides you've done before. Take your new power meter. Let's say you've got an outside power meter, go outside with it, which I know right now in North America might be starting to get difficult. But get a feel. Go do an effort that you would normally do. Go up a hill at a hard pace you normally would, and take a look afterwards and see what kind of power you were holding. If you don't have any idea where your power number should be, this is a great way to start to get a feel for what it feels like to hold 300 watts. Okay, start to translate the real wattage numbers to what you're doing. This is going to be you're going to need to build this up over time. And a crucial element of an FTP test is pacing. If you don't have a gut feel for what different power levels feel like, you may not do so hot on the test. You may not get what you're looking for. So all these things are in preparation for that test, right? You want to have an idea of where you should be at, more or less. And I'm apparently getting dropped from the group, but that's okay. I'll just spin up to him here real quick. And okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about, so I got a test. This test's going to give me a number. People call it FTP. What is that? File transfer protocol? No, it's not that. It stands for functional threshold power. Okay, and a lot of times you're going to hear, not necessarily that this is completely accurate and true, but you're going to hear it's about as much power you could hold for an hour. Okay, if you went all out for an hour, how much power you could hold. We'll get into how that's not completely and entirely true, but you definitely hear that a lot. And so what is it? Why are we doing it? Well, this functional threshold power is the power we're going to use to train that's approximating what I'm going to call lactate threshold. Okay, so lactate threshold refers to some phenomenon in the body with generating lactate. And while we can't directly measure lactate levels with a power meter, that requires blood samples to do that test, we can measure power at certain durations. And there's been lots of studies that kind of say, okay, well, this is a good approximation here of what lactate threshold really is. So without getting into the gory details of lactate threshold, which I will later, let's break down what a very typical structured FTP test is going to look like, okay? Many software packages out there, Zwift, Trainer Road, many different platforms are going to have a test structured around a single 20-minute long effort. This isn't the only type of FTP test, but this is the most common. So what do? Well, so you're going to have some warm-up. This one even has a 20-minute long warm-up, which is kind of long actually, but it's fine. You want to get your legs ready underneath you. And then it has some, so you see those spikes after that ramp, basically has some efforts to get the blood circulating, wake up the legs, right? Some efforts to just basically get the pistons firing. Typically a little bit of a longer effort to open it up even more, followed by some more rest, easy riding to clear that out. And then you're going to do a 20-minute long interval. And the goal of this interval is to hold the highest average power possible for that entire 20 minutes. It's not to go out and kill yourself in 2 minutes and barely hold on for the rest, but you want to pace yourself, okay? So there's a lot of pacing that comes into play here. But this is what the test is going to look like, okay? And so a lot of studies that have analyzed lab tests of threshold power and power curves of average cyclists have determined that if you take 95% of the average power number that you do for that 20 minutes, that's most likely very close to what your true lactate threshold would be. And for all intents and purposes, it's a great number to use for training, okay? Not everyone fits that 95% bill perfectly, but for getting started, it's absolutely, this is the way to go. Now, you may say, hey, you know what? I was riding on Zwift the other day. I didn't do this test. I was just riding around, did a race, whatever. And at the end, it said, hey, we detected a new FTP. How did it do that? I didn't have a test. Well, Zwift can detect where your best 20-minute power happened throughout your entire ride. Any training software does this. And they basically say, okay, they take 95% of your best 20-minute power, and they look to see if that's higher than what your current FTP is set at. So let's say you go out and do a race, and you end up doing a 20-minute effort that would bump you up to a new FTP. Well, it's going to go and say, hey, you've performed a new 20-minute best. Would you like to update your FTP? So, and that is very common. Lots of software packages do that. In fact, I'm going to say I can only think of two that are the exceptions to this. I would think WKO4 uses a more advanced model, as well as I haven't played much with Exert, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were using a different model to get to FTP. Now, I could be wrong on that. They may still be using 95% of your best 20-minute effort. At any rate, that is the most common test. Okay, so you say that's the most common, Justin. What are the alternatives? Well, the real thing we're trying to get at here is actual lactate measurement. So your muscles generate lactate, and typically they generate into your blood, and they measure that in millimoles per liter. And your body has the ability to clear out that lactate at a certain rate, but there becomes an imbalance where you're generating too much lactate and your body can't clear it out. So that's the threshold that we're talking about, that lactate threshold, where your body can no longer clear out that lactate that's being generated. Okay? So if you want to be real, you get the number, there's lactate lab tests. Now there's actually two different styles of lactate testing in the lab. One of them says, okay, you know what? We've measured a lot of different people, and we know that in general, the body can clear out lactate at the rate of 4 millimoles per liter. And so they just simply up the power until you generate 4 millimoles per liter or a little bit more. And they say wherever you're generating 4 millimoles per liter of lactate, that's your threshold. Well, there's another test that says, you know, again, not everybody is the same, and some may actually be able to clear lactate faster than 4 millimoles per liter. And so what that test does is it will actually, it basically, you do like a ramp test. So you keep increasing the power slowly over time, and they monitor the rate at which, they graph the rate at which you're generating lactate. And they basically are looking for when you get to a point where the lactate levels in your blood are not staying steady. Because if your lactate levels starting to rise, that means, or you know, if you just say you're holding a constant power output, but your lactate levels are rising, that means you're above that threshold where your body isn't clearing it out fast enough. And so that will do two things. It will tell if you're actually if your body's at 4 millimoles per liter, or whatever that is, that rate. But that's the hard biological science that we're attempting to get at here. But I don't have a lactate measurement lab on my bike. It's complicated, you know, people don't like getting pricked by needles, right? It's not something we can do every day. So this is why we have tests where they've said, okay, look at massive amounts of actual training data, just power and power curves, and using that, we can get really good approximations of what we would get in the lab. So we talked about the 20-minute test, taking 95% of that effort. There's another test here that's just based on your bike where you're going to do 2 8-minute long intervals. And I don't recall offhand how much rest they give you in between. I'm not sure that that's an important part of the test, but if you find a test, it'll have it dictated for you. And basically, concept is the same. You're going to go all out for 8 minutes, best average power, you'll rest, and then you'll do it again. They'll take the average of those two efforts, and at this time they're going to take 90% of the number, because as you can imagine, you can hold higher power for 8 minutes than you can for 20 minutes. So that's why it bumps down to 90. Now, not everyone, so a 20-minute test may give you a different FTP than an 8-minute test. This can depend on how strong your VO2 max is. So those with a much stronger VO2 max may score a very high or a higher FTP using this 8-minute test than they would on the 20-minute test. What does that matter? Well, it may make some of your longer 20-minute intervals very difficult. Let's say you're super strong in the VO2 level, but your 20-minute power is not so great. Well, if you're scoring a really high FTP in this 8-minute test, and then trying to do 20-minute long workouts based on that, and you find you just cannot complete them, well, maybe that just shows your VO2 is stronger, you tested higher there, but you may need to maybe say do a 20-minute long test to get a number that's right for doing 20-minute long intervals. So there's a trade-off there. So what other things exist? You've probably heard of, we talked about Exert, and they have an app you can put on your Garmin that will actually live read out your FTP while you're riding. I don't know the math and science specifically behind this. I have gotten some feedback from the small number of people who've tried it, and they say, you know, generally it gets in the right ballpark. One thing here is you're not going to be able to just go out and do a coffee ride and come back and say, oh yeah, it picked up my FTP. It knows exactly how strong I am. Because, well, it doesn't know if you were going, I mean, it has to assume at some point you were going hard. And so if you were just going easy the whole time, it's going to think your easy was hard, right? So you need to put in some hard efforts for it to actually come up with a reasonable FTP number. Otherwise, it's just shooting in the dark. WKO4 will analyze a large volume of your historical performances and take lots of factors into play. I would say it does eventually follow the 20-minute effort, and so I don't know the actual formulas, but I can just describe my experience from comparing 20-minute bests to a WKO4 model over time. And if I were to try to describe how it differs, I would say that it basically is not going to jump the gun and say you need a new FTP the very first time you perform better at 20 minutes. It's basically, I would say it waits a little bit for you to prove over time that, yeah, okay, you've done this a couple times, you filled out that power chart, now it's obvious from more data rather than just a single data point that you really have improved over your previous threshold. So I would say one thing that I think anyone should take in mind is if you're using a piece of software, at the end of your ride or workout, whatever, it says, hey, you got a new FTP, I would first, pay attention to that. If it's 50% higher than your previous FTP and you went really hard in your previous one, you probably had some equipment change you want to look into. May not, improving 50% is very significant. And although I wouldn't say it's astronomical for someone getting started, you'll get lots of really rapid gains at the beginning. So it's not impossible, but I guess if you've already got something somewhat established and then you increase by 50%, most likely you had a equipment gain. I mean, if we're talking, you'll see much lower gains than that over time. And it depends on how long you've been going at it. But the point, I think what I want to get at is you shouldn't just trust what the software is telling you verbatim and say, okay, let's see if I make sure my power meter was calibrated. Let's do another event similar and see if I can do it again. Maybe I just had a breakout performance, which happens, but I'm not quite ready to perform on that level day in and day out and do my workouts based on it. So in that case, you may want to wait until you perform that 20-minute power again before saying, I'm ready to do the workouts at this level. So again, it's a personal choice, but everyone has their own method of doing it. And I think the overarching principle here with all these testing protocols is be consistent and be specific, be methodical. Keep whatever method you do and use that as your baseline, because if you're changing the test you do every time you do a test, it's really hard to compare results because you're changing the parameters of the test. Therefore, you're not exactly getting an apples to apples comparison. You might not have actually improved, or you might not have degraded, because some tests can, you can perform better on certain tests for one reason or another that you might not otherwise. So be aware of that while you're taking your test. Okay, so this leads into structured training, power-based training levels. I'm not going to get in depth too much on this talk because we will have another one where we go into more detail, but just know that, okay, I've got an FTP, and there's you basically are going to set up zones that are based on percentages of that FTP that you're going to train in. And the workouts that you get from, say, Zwift or Trainer Road or Sufferfest, they are structured in a way to say, hey, you're going to hold 90% of your FTP for 5 minutes. So that's why when everyone loads the workout, they get their own specific and custom workout, because they're based on these zones that are percentages of your FTP. Now, some software gets a bit fancier than that because these zones can alter and change for different people because of the different strengths of your power curve. And so this is where WKO4 introduces a concept called individualized power levels. And it'll get a little bit more specific. That's an advanced concept. I'd say, this is going to apply very well to most people. But just know that, again, these numbers are an average thing that applies to most people, but it may not be true for absolutely everybody. And if they are off, it's not going to be off by a ton. Here's a table. I'm sure you probably can't read it. It's a little small. But what I want to get at is, where do these different zones come from? They come from studying the effects of different levels of power compared to your threshold, and what kind of adaptations that creates on the body. Think of putting power out in a certain zone as like a different kind of lifting a different weight or a different weight machine. And they can work out different parts of your system, anaerobic, aerobic, endurance. And so they all have different purposes. And this chart lines out these 7 zones and what kind of improvements you should be expecting from them. Doing sprints, for example, will not increase your FTP. It will increase your sprinting ability, but just doing sprint workouts all the time, you most certainly aren't going to see an improvement in your FTP. Okay, so knowing your FTP is vital. Why is that? Well, let's get in more precise and say it's not just knowing your single FTP. In reality, understanding and knowing the power you can hold across the entire time range, that's called the power curve. We can get into this later. Knowing that whole thing, so like how much power you can hold for 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour. Knowing that whole gamut is actually really what you want to know. And this is exactly what you've probably heard Sufferfest talking about 4DP recently. Okay, so they're taking 4 different points of the power curve. You got your FTP. I think they use 5 minute, 1 minute, and 30 seconds maybe. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But the point is here, they're driving home that knowing more than just one of those points along the power curve is important. And in fact, your relative ability in these different power zones shapes the type of cyclist you are. We'll get into that later. That's called power profiling. And lastly, you're going to want to test consistently. Don't take the slides literally to say you need to do a 60-minute all-out test. To do this, point is test consistently. Most tests, remember, are an approximation of lactate thresholds. And so it may be interesting to compare some of these different tests. If you've done one, do another one, see how it compares. Maybe if you have the ability to go into a lab and do a lactate threshold test and compare it with how you're doing. These can all be very informative pieces of information when you start comparing them. So with that, we have reached the Q&A session. Let us know in the comments. Have you done an FTP test? How did it feel? You wanted to do it again? Any questions on the different FTP testing protocols? Happy to answer them. I'm by no means an expert in all of this, but I've at least done a little bit of homework and hopefully can answer some of these questions. Want to also just remind you guys that if you've come into this late, didn't quite get the whole episode, you can go ahead and it'll be available live on Facebook afterwards. It'll also be on our YouTube channel. Also Twitch and Mixer will have them, but also the new one is a podcast. So if you search whatever your favorite podcast provider, search for The Endurance Lab, and you will find a podcast that brings in all the Team ODZ content. So later today, you should see this podcast appearing as a podcast on the Endurance Lab. So if you needed to listen to it on your drive to work or at lunchtime, whatever, you don't want to necessarily have to look at the video, we're making that available. So with that, don't see a lot of questions coming in, which is completely fine. We're by no means bound to keep this thing open for forever. If you have questions, let them come in. But before I sign off here, I just want to remind you that we are, so talk a little bit about all the different software packages that are available. We'll compare a lot of them, contrast them. There's a lot of good free solutions out there. We do have a couple questions. I'm just going to address them really quickly. Any opinion on the Zwift 4-week FTP builder, says Jim Hahn. Jim, so I would say any structured if you haven't done a structured workout program before, picking any and just getting exposed to it and seeing what it feels like and going through it, that's a good step, okay? For my first workout program, I just picked something out of Zwift, to be honest, and I've kind of built on it since. I would say I wouldn't worry about finding the best training program for your first one so much as getting your feet wet and getting into it. So I have no specific reason not to recommend that training program, nor any specific reasons to say that it's the best in the world. I'd say I'm sure it's great. How's that for a non-answer? All right, Paul Hurst says, how many FTP should you carry out over the year? And what about in a racing season? I am a TT person. Okay, so that's a great question. I'm sure many people have varying opinions on this, but I could give you a feel for what I do. So I tend to, I'll do a lot of races on Zwift that'll stress me for 20 minutes, and so I kind of watch how I'm performing there, because that's kind of an FTP test. So from that perspective, I test fairly regularly, but relatively, I would say it's probably more important to stay, it's more beneficial to do your FTP test while you're in a structured training, so not necessarily in the middle of the season, just because you see the growth and the benefit that you've gained over these workouts, as well as it'll help you go to the next level by upping your workouts by that extra percentage. I'm sure you can find arguments for it being just as important to update it during the racing season, but I find that I'm usually not actually making improvements on my FTP during the racing season either, nor am I really testing it. I'm really focused on specific races, which may or may not require a 20-minute effort. So, but as a TTer, I can see you definitely, most of your races are going to require, if you're only racing TTs, probably more important to test it more often during the season so you can really drive home and hammer each race. Now, more importantly, it's important to know your power curve for whatever the duration of your TT is expected to be, which may not be an hour, may not be 20 minutes, it might be 10 minutes, might be 30 minutes. And so knowing your power curves for those specific TTs is even more so important than knowing your FTP. Richard Linnell, I don't want to do any more FTP tests, but I know they're pretty useful to understand your power curve. However, I can see my power curve in Strava. Can this not be used as a good indicator? Great question, Richard. And you bring up a good point. A lot of people just don't do a structured 20-minute FTP test. They don't do well at it. It just doesn't work for them. And you know what? That is okay. I would say knowing your power curve, so Strava will show your power curve. Many other training platforms will also show you your power curve. What you may be running, so that is perfectly acceptable with one caveat, I would say, if you are looking at your best 20-minute power number on that curve and saying 95% of it is your FTP, but you haven't ever actually done a really hard 20-minute power effort, you may be selling yourself short. Okay? That would be my only concern. If you haven't done something where you're really stressing yourself for 20 minutes, you may not have a number that's going to get you the most bang for your buck. So in that case, you may be under training a bit. Your workouts would still be hard, but they may not be pushing you as much as they need to be. That would be my only real concern with that approach. But if you're racing a lot and really stressing yourself at that 20-minute mark or more, that can certainly be a great way to go. Structured FTP tests, especially by yourself, are in no means fun. Okay, well, thank you all for the questions. Those are great. Hope my answers helped you out. If you have any further questions, let them fly. After the show, we can address them. You can also send us an email at WUWP@teamodz.com. So WUWP for What's Up with Power @teamodz.com. We can address those offline. But I appreciate everyone coming. Thank you so much. We'll be on here again next week. Same time, same channel. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.